Inside the cavernous hangar of the Asterian Aviation Museum, spotlights cut through the darkness like runway beacons, illuminating a grand piano positioned beneath the suspended wing of a vintage jet. The aircraft hung frozen in eternal flight, its silver fuselage catching fragments of light, while hundreds of guests in evening attire filled rows of chairs arranged across the polished concrete floor. Finn sat in the last row, his calloused hands resting on his knees, his hearing aid switched off. He had learned years ago that the distortion it created only made the world more confusing, so he chose silence instead. His daughter Bonnie approached the piano, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the keys. But before she could play a single note, Clinton raised his hand from the front row, his smile sharp as broken glass. "The gala is not for charity cases," he announced, his voice carrying through the steel rafters. Carter, seated nearby, let out a whistle that echoed off the metal walls like a slap. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Finn rose from his seat without asking permission. He walked down the center aisle, past the turned heads and whispered judgments, climbed onto the stage, and placed his palm flat against the body of the piano. He could not hear the notes, but he could feel them. He looked at Bonnie once, a promise carved into his expression, and then he began to play. The Wings and Keys Gala had become the most prestigious fundraising event in the region, a night where art and aviation history merged under the dramatic architecture of the Asterian hangar. The museum's director, George, had spent months preparing for this evening. Every detail had been calculated to impress the donors and patrons who filled the seats. The vintage jet suspended above the piano was a 1950s masterpiece, its swept wings and chrome accents representing an era when flight still seemed miraculous. The piano beneath it was a statement of equal ambition, a 9-foot concert grand that George had personally selected to complement the acoustics of the space. The hangar's steel walls and concrete floor created a unique sound environment, where every note lingered longer than expected, where whispers carried farther than they should, and where laughter could feel like thunder. Clinton had positioned himself as the artistic director of the evening, a title he had claimed through years of careful maneuvering within the museum's social hierarchy. He controlled the program, selected the performers, and determined who would receive the evening's scholarship awards. His influence extended beyond mere administration. He had cultivated relationships with every major donor in attendance, including Serafina, the chairwoman of the foundation's board. To the casual observer, Clinton appeared to be a man of refined taste and generous spirit. Only those who had worked closely with him understood the calculation behind every gesture, the ruthlessness beneath the charm. Bonnie had prepared for this moment for 3 years. She was 15, old enough to understand what the scholarship could mean for her future, young enough to still believe that talent and hard work might be enough to earn it. Her mother had died when she was 7, leaving her father to raise her alone on a maintenance technician's salary. They lived in a small apartment on the edge of town, where Bonnie practiced on an electronic keyboard with weighted keys that her father had saved for 6 months to purchase. She had learned to play by watching videos, by feeling the rhythm in her bones, by adapting to her father's world of vibration and visual cues rather than expecting him to adapt to hers. Finn had worked at the museum for 8 years, maintaining the lighting rigs and sound equipment that made events like this possible. He arrived early and stayed late, troubleshooting problems that others could not solve, anticipating failures before they occurred. His colleagues respected his competence but rarely engaged him in conversation. Communication required effort when your coworker could not hear, and most people preferred the path of least resistance. They saw only the maintenance uniform, the hearing aids that he rarely activated, the careful way he watched lips to understand what was being said. They did not see the man who had once filled concert halls, who had made audiences weep with the precision of his touch, who had dreamed of teaching the world to hear music the way he heard it. Only Elias, who worked the night shift alongside him, had bothered to learn the basic signs that made friendship possible. Elias understood that Finn's silence concealed a history that the man himself refused to discuss. Some wounds, Elias had learned, heal better when they are not constantly examined. The micro-audition format was Clinton's innovation, a way to evaluate young performers in compressed bursts of 60 to 90 seconds. The brevity favored those with technical flash over emotional depth, which suited Clinton's preferences perfectly. Carter had been groomed for this moment since childhood, his wealthy parents ensuring he received instruction from the finest teachers, performance opportunities at the most exclusive venues, and introductions to the people who mattered. When he took the stage earlier in the evening, his performance had been technically immaculate and emotionally vacant, like watching a machine execute a program with perfect precision. Bonnie's turn came near the end of the program. She walked to the piano with her sheet music clutched against her chest, her posture straight despite the trembling in her hands. She had chosen a piece that she loved rather than one designed to impress, a decision she now questioned as she felt the weight of so many eyes upon her. She sat on the bench, adjusted her position, and placed her fingers on the keys. The first chord rang out clear and true, a sound that surprised even her with its fullness. But before she could play another note, Clinton's voice cut through the hall. He did not need a microphone. The acoustics of the hangar carried his words to every corner of the space. He explained that the program was running behind schedule, that certain adjustments needed to be made, that not every applicant could be accommodated. He spoke with the reasonable tone of a man making difficult but necessary decisions. He did not mention Bonnie by name. He did not need to. Everyone understood who was being dismissed. Carter filled the silence that followed with a low whistle, the kind of sound that boys make when they want to wound without leaving visible marks. Others in the audience laughed, some from cruelty and others from discomfort, their nervous energy seeking any outlet. The steel walls amplified the sound until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Bonnie sat frozen at the piano, her hands still poised above the keys, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Henry, the head of security, received a subtle signal from Clinton and began moving toward the stage. His job was to maintain order, to remove problems before they escalated, to protect the museum's reputation above all else. He had dealt with disappointed applicants before, had learned to execute removals with minimal drama. He did not think of the people involved as individuals with hopes and histories. They were situations to be managed, variables to be controlled. Finn watched from the back of the hall, his hearing aids still off, reading the situation through visual cues that most hearing people would miss. He saw Clinton's smirk before the man's lips had finished forming the words. He saw Carter's whistle through the shape of the boy's mouth and the reaction of those nearby. He saw Bonnie's shoulders cave inward, saw the brightness drain from her eyes, saw her mouth form the silent word that looked like sorry. He knew that she was apologizing to him, apologizing for failing to secure the future she had promised herself, apologizing for being the daughter of a deaf maintenance worker who dared to dream of something better. When Bonnie looked toward him, seeking his face among the crowd, Finn saw something that shattered the careful walls he had built around his heart. He saw his daughter shake her head almost imperceptibly, warning him to stay back, to stay invisible, to accept this humiliation rather than risk a greater one. She was protecting him. She was 15 years old, had just been publicly dismissed from the opportunity she had worked years to earn, and her first instinct was to protect her father from additional shame. The anger that rose in Finn was not the hot explosion of lost temper, but the cold clarity of absolute resolve. He had spent a decade swallowing his pride, accepting his diminished place in a world that no longer valued what he could offer, telling himself that invisibility was the price of survival. He had done this for Bonnie, believing that a steady job and a stable home mattered more than dignity. He had convinced himself that pride was a luxury that fathers like him could not afford. that the measure of a man was not how others treated him, but how well he provided for his child. But watching his daughter shrink beneath the laughter of strangers, he understood that he had taught her the wrong lesson. He had taught her that people like them should accept what they were given and never demand more. He had taught her that silence in the face of cruelty was wisdom rather than surrender. Finn stood up. The movement drew attention because it was unexpected, because maintenance workers did not occupy seats among the donors and guests. He walked down the center aisle with the deliberate pace of someone who had stopped caring about the opinions of others. He felt the eyes on him, but could not hear the whispers that accompanied them. He climbed the steps to the stage where his daughter still sat, her face wet with tears she had not realized she was crying. Henry moved to intercept him, but Finn's expression stopped the security chief mid-stride. There was no aggression in Finn's posture, no threat of violence or disruption. There was only the unshakable certainty of a man who had finally decided to stop hiding. Finn signed to Henry with deliberate clarity, requesting one song, just one, for his daughter. Henry understood enough to grasp the request, but not enough to know how to refuse it without creating a larger scene. Clinton watched this unfold with rising alarm. He recognized Finn immediately, though he had not seen the man's face in over a decade. The maintenance uniform had been an effective disguise, allowing Clinton to pass within feet of his former victim without recognition. But now, with Finn standing in the spotlight, the past threatened to breach the carefully constructed present. Clinton's mind raced through possible responses, ways to contain the situation before it spiraled beyond his control. Carter broke the tension with a sneer. "Can you even play?" he asked, directing the question at Finn with theatrical condescension. The audience laughed again, relieved to have a clear target for their discomfort. Carter's cruelty was familiar and therefore safe, a known quantity in an evening that had suddenly become unpredictable. Finn did not respond to the mockery. He could not hear the words, and even if he could, they would not have mattered. He walked to the piano where Bonnie still sat, placed his hand on her shoulder, and felt her lean into his touch. She looked up at him with an expression that combined hope and fear in equal measure. She knew what he was risking. She also knew that stopping him was impossible. He sat beside her on the bench, a position that forced her to slide to the side but kept them connected. He placed his right hand on the treble keys and his left on the bass, his fingers finding their positions through decades of muscle memory. Then he lifted his left hand and placed it flat against the piano's body, pressing his palm against the lacquered wood. The vibrations would tell him everything he needed to know. Clinton seized the microphone from its stand, ready to end this spectacle with administrative authority. But before he could speak, Serafina's voice cut through the hall with the precision of a blade. "Let him play," she said, and her tone made clear that this was not a request. Serafina had built her fortune by recognizing what others missed, by trusting her instincts when logic suggested caution. Something about the deaf man at the piano triggered those instincts now. Finn began with a single low note, a rumble that seemed to emanate from the floor itself. The hangar's acoustics caught the sound and multiplied it, filling the space with a resonance that vibrated in the chest of every listener. He let the note decay completely before adding another, building a foundation of sound that felt less like music and more like the awakening of something ancient. The piece he played had no official name, though in his mind he had always called it Runway Lullaby. He had written it for Bonnie when she was 3 years old, when his hearing was already failing but had not yet disappeared entirely. It was the last piece he had composed before the accident that stole his auditory world, the final gift of a father who knew he was losing the ability to hear his daughter's voice. Every note contained a promise, a declaration that no matter how far she flew, he would always be the ground she could return to. Clinton's face drained of color as the melody unfolded. He recognized it immediately, though the version he had performed for years lacked the emotional depth that Finn now brought to every phrase. Clinton had stolen the composition, changed a few harmonies, registered it under his own name, and built a reputation on its foundation. He had believed that Finn was gone, destroyed by the accident that Clinton himself had arranged, buried in obscurity where the truth could never resurface. The audience fell silent as the music swelled. The technical virtuosity was undeniable, each passage executed with a precision that seemed impossible for someone who could not hear the notes. But the technique was merely a vehicle for something far more profound. The music told a story without words, painting images of loss and hope, of darkness and light, of a father's love that transcended every obstacle the world had placed in his path. Audrey, the elderly composer who served on the scholarship committee, leaned forward in her seat, her practiced ear dissecting every phrase. She had heard this piece performed before, had even praised Clinton for its composition years ago, but she had always sensed something missing in those performances, an emotional hollowness that the technical execution could not disguise. Now she understood why. The man who had written this music was playing it for the first time in public, and the difference was devastating. Bonnie watched her father's hands move across the keys, watched the concentration on his face as he felt each vibration and translated it into the next movement. She had grown up knowing that her father had once been a pianist, that music had been stolen from him along with his hearing, that he had sacrificed everything to give her a stable home, but she had never truly understood what he had lost until this moment. She was witnessing the resurrection of something that should have died a decade ago, and the beauty of it overwhelmed her. The piece built toward its climax, the left hand driving forward with increasing intensity while the right hand sang a melody that seemed to float above the chaos. The hangar itself seemed to breathe with the music, the steel walls resonating in sympathy with the piano's voice. The vintage jet suspended overhead caught the vibrations and added its own subtle hum, as if the machine wanted to join the performance. Guests who had never attended a classical concert found themselves leaning forward, drawn into the emotional current that Finn's hands created. Even those who had laughed at his daughter minutes earlier sat transfixed, their earlier cruelty exposed by the undeniable beauty that now filled the space. Then, at the height of the crescendo, the pedal beneath Finn's foot stuck. Someone had tampered with it, wedging a small piece of rubber into the mechanism that prevented it from releasing fully. The sustain built and built, notes blurring together into dissonance. A hearing pianist would have panicked, would have stopped to diagnose the problem, but Finn did not need to hear the muddy sound to know something was wrong. He felt the resistance in the pedal, felt the way the vibrations changed when harmonies that should have been clear became clouded. He adapted without missing a beat, shifting his approach to compensate for the failed equipment. The modification transformed the piece in real time, turning what could have been a disaster into something unexpected and beautiful. He released the pedal entirely and let his fingers do the work of creating sustain through technique alone, a feat that required inhuman precision, but that his years of playing without hearing had prepared him to execute. Elias, watching from the technical booth, realized what had happened. He had seen Clinton speaking with one of the stage crew earlier, had thought nothing of it at the time. Now the pieces connected. He pulled out his phone and began recording, capturing evidence of what he suspected was deliberate sabotage. The final passage of the piece was the quietest, a lullaby in its truest sense. The notes descended like snowflakes, each one distinct and precious, until only a single tone remained. Finn held it as long as the physics of the piano would allow, his palm pressed against the wood to feel the exact moment when the vibration faded to nothing. When it was gone, he sat motionless, his hands resting on the keys, his eyes closed. The silence that followed was absolute. 500 people held their breath in a space designed to amplify every sound. The moment stretched until it seemed impossible to bear. Then Bonnie threw her arms around her father and sobbed into his shoulder, and the spell broke. The applause began with Serafina. She rose from her seat in the front row and brought her hands together with slow, deliberate purpose. Others followed, first a few and then a wave, until the entire hangar thundered with appreciation. Some guests raised their hands and waved them in the air, the sign language gesture for applause that hearing audiences use to include deaf performers. Finn could not hear the ovation, but he could see it. He could feel the floor shake with the stamp of feet. He could read the expressions of genuine emotion on faces that had shown only contempt minutes before. But Clinton was not finished. He grabbed the microphone and interrupted the applause with practiced authority, his voice cutting through the celebration like a cold wind. He expressed appreciation for the spontaneous performance while simultaneously undermining it, characterizing Finn's actions as a violation of the program's structure rather than a triumph of human spirit. He invoked safety protocols and liability concerns, framing his objection as responsible administration rather than personal vendetta. Carter, sensing an opportunity to ingratiate himself with his mentor, added his own commentary. He suggested that Finn had simply reproduced a famous work that anyone could perform, that muscle memory was not the same as artistry, that the audience had been manipulated by sentiment rather than moved by genuine quality. The accusation hung in the air, toxic and deliberate. It was Ingrid who stepped forward, her press credentials gleaming beneath the lights. The journalist had covered dozens of cultural events, had learned to sense when a story ran deeper than its surface. She directed her question at Clinton, asking him to identify the composer of the piece that had just been performed. The question was simple, but its implications were nuclear. If Clinton claimed credit for the composition, he would need to explain how a deaf maintenance worker had performed it with such intimacy. If he denied knowledge of the piece, he would contradict years of public statements about his creative achievements. Clinton's hesitation was brief, but unmistakable. He deflected with practiced smoothness, suggesting that the origin of the music was less important than the program's integrity, that questions about composition could be addressed through proper channels at an appropriate time. But Ingrid had her answer. The man was hiding something, and she intended to discover what. George, the museum director, found himself caught between competing pressures. The evening had spiraled far beyond his ability to control, generating the kind of public attention that could destroy his career or make it, depending on how events unfolded. He announced a brief intermission, an administrative pause that would allow him to assess the situation and determine his next move. Some guests used the break to approach Finn with words of congratulation. Others clustered around Clinton, seeking reassurance that the evening would proceed as planned. Serafina cornered Finn near the stage, her expression combining curiosity with calculation. She asked him directly about the piece he had performed, about its history and his connection to it. Finn's responses came through a combination of written notes and lip reading, a slow process that frustrated the chairwoman's impatience but could not shake her growing conviction that she had witnessed something important. She summoned Vivian, the Foundation's attorney, and instructed her to begin a quiet investigation into the evening's events. In the days that followed, the video spread across the internet with the velocity of genuine human interest. The clip had everything that captured collective attention: a vulnerable child, a triumphant underdog, a moment of transcendent beauty emerging from humiliation. Within 48 hours, the performance had accumulated millions of views. News organizations requested interviews. Strangers sent messages of support. The attention brought scrutiny that Clinton had spent years avoiding. Bonnie returned to school as a reluctant celebrity. Some classmates treated her with newfound respect, while others dismissed her father's performance as a sympathy ploy designed to manipulate public opinion. A teacher made a comment within her hearing about people who exploited disability for attention. The words cut deeper than any insult hurled in the hangar, because they came wrapped in the authority of someone she had trusted. Clinton moved to protect himself through legal channels, filing a complaint alleging that Finn had violated museum protocols and disrupted an official event. The paperwork requested that Finn be terminated for cause and barred from museum property. George found the documents on his desk the morning after the gala, accompanied by a strongly worded suggestion from Clinton that prompt action would be in everyone's best interest. But Vivian's investigation had already begun yielding results. She discovered records showing that Clinton had registered the composition under his own name 12 years earlier, just months after a young pianist named Finn had suffered a workplace accident that left him deaf. She found references to the original piece in programs from performances that predated Clinton's registration. She located witnesses who remembered Finn's early career, his promise, and his sudden disappearance from the musical world. Audrey contributed her professional analysis, detailing the specific techniques and harmonic choices that revealed the true author's identity. She explained that composers develop signatures as distinctive as fingerprints, patterns of thought and emotion that persist across their work. The piece performed at the gala bore no relationship to anything else Clinton had ever claimed to write. It was, however, entirely consistent with Finn's documented style from his performing years. Elias provided the final piece of evidence. Searching through the museum's archives, he discovered security footage from the night of Finn's accident. The recording had been misfiled for years, forgotten in a system that predated digital organization. It showed Clinton entering the sound equipment area shortly before the catastrophic feedback event that had destroyed Finn's hearing. The footage proved nothing by itself, but it raised questions that demanded answers. Serafina convened a special session of the Foundation's board, inviting Ingrid to attend as an observer and Clinton to respond to the allegations that had accumulated against him. The meeting took place in the same hangar where the gala had occurred, the grand piano still positioned beneath the suspended jet. The symbolism was deliberate. Whatever verdict emerged would be pronounced in the space where the truth had first begun to surface. Clinton arrived with lawyers and denials, his confidence visibly strained but his combativeness intact. He attacked Finn's credibility, questioned Audrey's motives, suggested that Serafina had allowed personal sentiment to corrupt her judgment. He threatened litigation against anyone who repeated what he characterized as baseless accusations. He was, in every visible way, a man fighting for his survival. Finn sat quietly throughout the proceedings, his presence a constant reminder of what had been stolen. Bonnie sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, providing the connection that both of them needed. They did not speak as the evidence accumulated, did not react as Clinton's explanations grew increasingly desperate, did not celebrate as the board's members exchanged glances that communicated their shared conclusion. The final witness was Carter. The young pianist had spent the days since the gala in turmoil, his certainties crumbling beneath the weight of what he had observed. He had built his identity around Clinton's mentorship, had accepted the older man's worldview without question, had participated in cruelties he now recognized as indefensible. When Serafina asked him to share what he knew, he made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. Carter described conversations where Clinton had boasted about silencing a competitor, about ensuring that a talented rival would never threaten his position again. He recounted the instructions he had received before the gala, the specific words he was told to use when mocking Finn and Bonnie, the assurance that his compliance would be rewarded with opportunities and introductions. His testimony was devastating not because it contained shocking revelations, but because it painted a portrait of systematic cruelty that extended back more than a decade. Clinton's response was a masterwork of deflection that ultimately failed. He attacked Carter as a traitor, accused the board of conducting a witch hunt, suggested that the entire proceeding was a conspiracy orchestrated by people jealous of his success. But his arguments rang hollow against the accumulated evidence. His explanations contradicted themselves with increasing frequency, and his demeanor shifted from confident to cornered to desperate. George announced the board's decision with the gravity that the moment required. Clinton's association with the museum was terminated immediately. His name would be removed from all programs and publications. The scholarship fund would be restructured to ensure that future recipients were selected through transparent and equitable processes. Additionally, the museum would support any legal action that Finn chose to pursue regarding the theft of his intellectual property. Vivian filed the necessary paperwork the following week, initiating proceedings to restore ownership of the composition to its true author. The case drew attention from intellectual property experts and arts advocates, becoming a touchstone for discussions about exploitation in creative industries. Clinton's reputation collapsed with remarkable speed, his former allies distancing themselves from association with his disgrace. The museum unveiled its new program 6 months later, an initiative designed to make music accessible to people with hearing loss. The curriculum combined traditional instruction with innovative techniques that emphasized physical sensation and visual cues, allowing students to experience rhythm and melody through channels that hearing audiences rarely considered. Finn served as the program's creative director, translating his years of adaptation into methods that could help others. Bonnie received her scholarship through the restructured process, her application evaluated by a committee that included Audrey and 2 other composers of unimpeachable integrity. The award recognized not only her technical ability but her artistic sensitivity, qualities that years of practicing alongside her father had cultivated. She would study at a conservatory that had educated generations of performers, carrying forward a tradition that her father had nearly been denied. The final performance took place on the anniversary of the Gala, in the same hangar where everything had changed. The museum had softened the space with warmer lighting, creating an atmosphere that felt less like an industrial building and more like a home designed for giants. The vintage jet still hung overhead, but now it seemed protective rather than imposing, a guardian watching over the gathering below. Bonnie took her place at the piano, her father standing beside her with his palm resting on the instrument's body. She played the opening of Runway Lullaby, the piece that had been stolen and then reclaimed, while Finn added a gentle percussion by tapping his fingers against the wooden case. The rhythm they created together was something that neither could have produced alone, a collaboration between sound and sensation, between the music she heard and the vibrations he felt. Andrea watched from the audience. The therapist who had helped Bonnie process the trauma of public humiliation and emerge stronger than before. Henry stood at the back of the hall, no longer concerned with removing problems, but simply present as a witness to something he had almost prevented. Carter sat in a middle row, his applause genuine despite the discomfort of his memories, beginning a long process of becoming someone worthy of the second chance he had been offered. When the piece concluded, Bonnie leaned against her father's shoulder and asked him what he thought. She shaped the words carefully so he could read them on her lips, a gesture that had become unnecessary over the years, but that she still made from habit and love. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured together, every sacrifice and every triumph, every moment of doubt and every decision to keep going anyway. Finn responded in sign language, his movements visible to everyone in the front rows, his hands shaping words that needed no translation. He told her that he could not hear the notes she played. He told her that the world of sound had been closed to him for years, that silence was the only constant in his auditory existence. He told her that he had mourned that loss every day for the first year, had raged against it for the second, had finally accepted it sometime during the third. Then he smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something younger and brighter, and his hands formed the final words. "But I have always heard you." The audience rose in ovation, some applauding with their hands and others with the waving gesture that included those who could not hear the thunder of their appreciation. Beneath the wing of the vintage jet, in the hangar where shame had been transformed into triumph, A father and daughter stood together as proof that love speaks in frequencies that no disability can silence. The runway lights dimmed slowly around them, but the warmth that filled the space would linger long after the last guest had departed, a reminder that dignity is not given by those who hold power but claimed by those who refuse to surrender it.